Hi, welcome everyone. We're just going to give it a minute to let the waiting room populate into the webinar, and then we'll get started. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to December's prep webinar. My name is Jen Sperduto. I'm joined by my colleague, Dawn Reinhardt Wood, and we are from the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions at Rutgers University. And today's prep webinar is Promoting Recovery Through Positive Psychology, presented by Kaitlin Mitchell and Dr. Michelle Zechner, also from the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions at Rutgers. I'm going to let them tell you a little bit more about them on the next slides. But I wanted to remind you that today's presentation is sponsored by the New Jersey Department of Health and the New Jersey Department of Human Services, along with the Rutgers Institute for Inpatient Psychiatric Rehabilitation, or IPR. So welcome. Today's webinar is an interactive training, and we really encourage you to ask questions and participate through the chat box or the Q&A. A training evaluation will be available at the end of the session via a link that Dawn's going to provide at the end. And from that training evaluation, you'll be able to access the handouts and training materials from today, and also get a certificate of attendance to say that you attended today's webinar. And we are being recorded, so a recording of the webinar will be available on the Rutgers IPR website that Dawn just posted tomorrow. So we welcome you to watch that one again. And if you missed any previous webinars, they're all available on that same page. So quick disclaimer, the PrEP program, the Psychiatric Rehabilitation Educational Program, is an online forum for a variety of topics relevant to inpatient psychiatric hospital staff. While Rutgers and DOH, DBHS, DMHAS are co-sponsors of the program, the PrEP webinars are peer presented, and as such, the content is independently developed by the presenter or presenters each month. So the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and don't necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent. So with that, again, reminding you that we're being recorded, so anything you say will be recorded. And I'm honored to present today's presenters, Kaitlin Mitchell and Dr. Michelle Zechner. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Zechner, and she's going to introduce herself and Kaitlin a little bit more. So Dr. Zechner, take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jen. It's great to be with you all again. I want to introduce my colleague, Kaitlin Mitchell, who is a senior training and consultation specialist in the Department of Psych Rehab at Rutgers. Her background is in clinical mental health practice, which informs her work as part of a statewide performance improvement initiative targeting the acute care system for people in need of crisis or emergency services. And Kaitlin is currently pursuing her PhD with a focus of applications of positive psychology for people living with serious mental health conditions. And I am Michelle Zechner. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Psych Rehab and Counseling Professions in the School of Health Professions at Rutgers. I teach and am involved in a clinical research intervention development and program evaluation, which supports health and wellness for people diagnosed with severe mental health conditions, with special expertise in aging. I've utilized positive psychology concepts in workforce development initiatives, in the coordination of a pilot study of the Positively Happier program, and in the development of an undergraduate resilience strategies and psychiatric rehabilitation course. So that's a little bit about us. You're going to hear from both Kaitlin and I. Next slide, please. We have a few objectives. We're going to talk about positive psychology, so you should be able to walk away and say what it is with confidence. Also, we're going to talk about that relationship between recovery and positive psychology in terms of mental health and mental health folks living with mental health conditions. And then we're going to have some practical applications of positive psychology concepts to an inpatient setting. I may know some of you. I forgot to mention something about myself that I consulted with the IPER for about 15 years. So I've consulted at multiple state psychiatric hospitals and was involved in a lot of implementation of psychiatric rehabilitation and recovery-oriented programs in hospital settings. Next slide, please. So, welcome. We want to know a little bit about you now. I'm going to open up my chat. Could you just type in, if you're comfortable, what your role is? Who are you? Are you a social worker? Are you a nurse? Are you a peer specialist? Who are you? And what state are you from? So if you just take a moment to drop that in the chat, we want to welcome you wherever you're coming from. If you're from the East Coast or West Coast or anywhere in between, tell us who you are and a little bit where you're from. So I see people from New Jersey, Arkansas, New York. That's wonderful. Oh, we even have folks from TPH, wonderful, and Greystone. Yay, hi friends from California, and more folks from, oh, Ancora's here. Wonderful. Oh, wonderful. It's so great to see you all. Oh, Texas, lovely. And Ancora, Fort Worth, Missouri, wonderful. Thank you so much. We appreciate you being here. Appreciate you dropping that in. It's so nice to see some familiar names and folks here joining us. So I'm going to turn it over to Kaitlin now. Kaitlin, sorry, Jen, next slide, please.
Thank you. So we'd like to begin this afternoon with a grounding activity that is rooted in positive psychology so that we can all start to experience some of these techniques. So we're going to try a simple exercise called 3 breaths, and it's really to help us let go of our distractions and focus on being here now. So to get started, just sit upright with your back supported and your feet on the ground. You can place your hands in a comfortable position, whether that's on your lap or letting them fall to your sides. And then gently close your eyes, or if you'd feel more comfortable, you can let your eyes gaze softly down towards the floor. And if at any point during this breathing practice you feel uncomfortable, you can just breathe normally. So we'll start by taking a slow, deep, comfortable breath in and feel your stomach expand as you breathe in. Try to hold that breath for a few seconds. And when you're ready, slowly exhale and say to yourself, relax. Now take a second, slow, deep breath. Again, feel your stomach expand fully as you breathe in. Hold your breath for a few seconds. Then as you exhale, say to yourself, I am here. Take a third, slow, deep breath. Again, feel your stomach expand fully as you breathe in, and hold your breath for a few seconds. Then, as you exhale, say to yourself, I am calm. Now let your breathing return to normal, and as it does, you can open your eyes. So we'd like to do a little reflection on that exercise. What did it feel like for you to focus on your breathing? Calming. Felt good, my soul caught up. Yeah, it gives you a moment to slow down. Paying attention to myself. Good. Slow down my mind, mindfulness, relaxing. Yeah. So I'm glad I'm focused. Always reminds me of how often I'm not breathing. Absolutely. Yeah. It's one of the things that we do all day and we don't always slow down to notice. So what are some other phrases that might be helpful to you? So we said relax, we said I am here, I am calm. Can you think of anything else that might be beneficial to say, either along with or instead of those phrases? More aware. I'm alive. Absolutely. That's a great one. Let go. Focus. I'm ready to receive. Thank you. Gratitude. Yes, I'm loved. All right. And so when might it be helpful for you to use a breathing practice like this? I need to slow down. Yeah. To connect with your body. Absolutely. Bring you back into the present moment. when you're running around and have too much on your plate, high stress, absolutely before a session or a meeting. Anytime is great when stressed or in need of reassurance. All right. Thank you all so much. We're going to move on now into a little bit about positive psychology, but I'm so glad you were able to experience some of it. Jen, if we can move on to the next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaitlin, so much for that. And thank you everyone for so eagerly participating. We wanted to give you a sample of some of the interventions that we've used in positive psychology groups so that you can sort of experience it for yourself. I suspect that some of you or many of you are using these very same interventions yourself. But let's talk about positive psychology for a moment. Martin Seligman is considered sort of the grandfather, the father of positive psychology at UPenn. And he sort of talked about positive psychology as a study of what is the pleasant life, the engaged life, or the meaningful life. I like to think of it more applied. We've worked a lot with Tony Zippel, who worked at Boston University for a while and is now really thinking a lot about positive psychology. And he describes it as thinking about what is working for a person. Chris Peterson, who's another positive psychologist who sort of initiated the thinking back in the 90s, describes it as a focus on human goodness and excellence, a life with emphasis on purpose and meaning, ultimately asking the question, what makes life worth living? I think these are questions are really important. Now, it's important to note that positive psychology was actually developed for the general population, not necessarily for people living with mental health conditions or symptoms. However, we and some other intrepid researchers are out there trying to say, these concepts really do apply for people living with mental health conditions and for people who are living right in the moment at state psychiatric hospitals or in other inpatient settings. Next slide, please. And some of the assumptions really are that every human being wants and deserves to be happier, and that happiness is inside of us, that our circumstances don't equal happiness. It's kind of independent. There have been a lot of studies that look at different factors and what leads to people feeling happier and having more sense of well-being. It isn't always what you think. A lot of examples are things like if I only lost 25 pounds, or if I only got that big raise, with an extra $10,000 a year, then I would be happier. But what's really interesting is what happens when those things happen. You're still you, I'm still me, and we don't always necessarily feel satisfied with that. And a lot of the research in happiness and positive psychology sort of say it's these tiny actions that we take every day, like that moment where we just took a breath together, where we took a moment to really check in with ourselves, that's actually an action that's connected to our well-being, to promoting happiness. So happiness is a process, not necessarily a destination. I always think about it as I always think about happiness as a kid. What would make me happy was a roller coaster ride, right? Or, cotton candy or something like that. That is a true sense of, can I get that thing? Yet we know more and more that it's about the meaning, it's about the purpose, and it's not necessarily the thing or the external factors. It's how we act and how we think inside of ourselves. And it really depends on each individual what makes us feel happier. Now, I don't want to, put my values on anybody else. But for example, I love to play the ukulele. I don't know about any of you, but I imagine that for Kaitlin, that would not be something that is in her happier toolbox. That would not be something that would make her feel happier. And I bet all of you would have a unique thing that you would say, when I spend time doing fill in the blank, these are the things that make me feel happier. And that, there may be some commonalities, but they're probably all different for each of us. Next slide, please. Some of the basics about happiness and positive psychology. I'm using the terms a little bit interchangeably, but typically positive psychology is thinking about how to promote well-being and happiness for people. And that is really this life of meaning and engagement. I really highly recommend, if people are interested in thinking more about this topic, to read, and I have trouble with her name, Lubomirsky's book, The How of Happiness, A Scientific Approach to Getting the Life You Want. She really lays out the science for all the things and the different research she's done and other researchers have done, which help think about happiness and what makes people feel happier. And then she has a real practical list of the actual tasks that are known to promote happiness in people. So I highly recommend that book. And what she says, and other researchers as well, is that feeling happier is determined by our genetics. Believe it or not, about 50% of our level of happiness and feeling happy is from our genes. Thanks, Mom. Thanks, Dad, right? And about 10% from our circumstances. But 40% is movable. 40%, and that's kind of where we're talking about it with you, to think about how can you help the folks in the hospitals leverage that 40% to feel just like, one step more happy, because all people can feel happier. Next slide, please. There's been some interesting research. Jen, can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. There's been some interesting research on well-being and happiness for people with serious mental illness. As I mentioned, not a lot of research. Our very own Kaitlin is doing her dissertation now, going to be doing some great research in this area. There's a little bit of research out there, and she's going to talk about that. But one interesting study that came out really asked people, interviewed 30 folks living with mental health conditions about what it was that really promoted well-being and happiness for them. And they found that it was really connected to relationships. Human connection and relationships was the number one thing. But also engaging in meaningful activities that lead to accomplishment. And having financial needs met was definitely important. And, kind of obviously, but it's important to point out that people who are really depressed often have a really hard time accessing happiness and well-being. And when we use some of these interventions, we have to talk about that and how to be very sensitive to the fact that people experiencing depression may have a harder time accessing these things. That's not to say, actually, there's been studies, and I think, Kaitlin, I think you're going to talk about this. There have been studies that show that people with depressive symptoms actually respond to positive psychology interventions, and people do feel better. We just need to take it a little more slowly. We need to be a little more careful and very mindful of valuing the person's experience in that moment. Next slide, please. I would love to hear in the chat if you have used any positive psychology concepts in your work before. Examples: happiness, resilience, grit, strength, well-being. I see we have an expert in positive psychology. I'm assuming that you're using it. Yay! I'd love to hear, is anyone else using positive psychology concepts in your work currently? Yes. Okay, great. Very nice. Very nice. Okay. And I do see some an observation that the happiness pie chart is actually 40% it's less, a little less than that, but there's still things that we can do. I think that's a very important point. Great. Oh, it's so great. It's wonderful to see that so many of you are using that. Oh, and character strengths. Oh, that's great. Next slide, please.
Michelle, we had one question in the chat that I just want to kind of put out there to you, because I'm not sure if you guys are planning to speak to this, but Miriam asked if you could speak to the overlap and/or difference between positive psychology and spirituality at some point.
I love that question. I would love to have lunch with you someday to have a big, long conversation about it. We're not going to talk about it. I can briefly say, in my mind, a lot of positive psychologists are thinking that spirituality, and when I say that, I mean it from a secular perspective, meaning and purpose sometimes is defined as spirituality. And, Seligman's model, that it talks about meaning, which is really linked to spirituality. And there is this overlap, but to me, in my mind, spirituality is also the pursuit of a higher power. It's and that could be meaning, but it could also be something different. So it's to me, it's a concept within positive psychology. If it's a strategy a person uses to feel happier, then it fits. But typically, positive psychology doesn't talk a lot about religion. It's interesting because I'm part of a group at the International Positive Psychology Association about spirituality, wrestling with this very question. Wonderful question. Thanks. Next slide, please.
So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how positive psychology is an approach that aligns with the way that we think about recovery in mental health. So positive psychology focuses on promoting the positive aspects of the human experience, things like hope and strength and personal growth, while at the same time fully acknowledging the challenges that living with a mental health condition can bring. So positive psychology asks that fundamental question that Dr. Zechner brought up before: what makes life worth living? So instead of focusing solely on reducing stress that people living with mental health conditions feel, it emphasizes building up those positive aspects as well. So I just want to point out, this doesn't mean ignoring mental health struggles. Life can absolutely bring significant challenges, especially for people living with serious mental health conditions. However, positive psychology offers this alternative lens for recovery. So rather than focusing on what's wrong or what's lacking, it encourages us to ask, what is strong about this person? What's meaningful to them? What brings joy and hope to their lives? So one of the key ideas of positive psychology is that mental illness and well-being are not mutually exclusive. A person can experience symptoms of mental illness while also experiencing moments of happiness, of fulfillment, and purpose. So positive psychology equips us with the tools to build well-being and help people live meaningful and empowered lives that extend beyond their symptoms. And this shift in focus contributes to a better quality of life. It promotes resilience and supports ongoing recovery. Jennifer, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So now we'll explore how enhancing well-being directly supports recovery. And I'm going to review some of the key elements of positive psychology that align with that recovery orientation. So recovery, as we know, is not a linear process, nor is it just about eliminating mental health symptoms, but instead recovery is this ongoing journey of growth, of self-discovery and purpose. And positive psychology supports this journey by emphasizing personal strengths and encouraging people to build lives that are personally meaningful to them. So with regard to this personal meaning and purpose, we know that recovery occurs when people discover meaning beyond their symptoms. So this could be reconnecting with hobbies that they enjoyed in the past, pursuing education, finding ways to give back to their community or connect with others, or even discovering something new, a new passion that they might enjoy, regardless of the psychiatric symptoms that they experience. Empowerment. So recovery, we know, is built on a foundation of choice and of goal setting. So by setting these small, achievable goals, like cooking a healthy meal, taking a short walk, this can help people become more confident and also feel a sense of control over their recovery journey. Strengths and abilities. So having a recovery orientation also aligns very closely with positive psychology because they both emphasize a person's strengths and their abilities and think about how they can be enhanced and how they can be harnessed to support a person's personal goals. Positive psychology and recovery also promote hope and optimism. And again, developing optimism doesn't mean denying challenges, but it means believing that positive change is possible, even when things aren't going well or when they feel really hard, and then taking small steps towards that better future. And improved quality of life. So recovery focuses on living a life that is fulfilling and satisfying, and engaging in enjoyable, meaningful activities is a part of this. So by focusing on strengths, on hope, and meaningful activities, we can empower the individuals that we work with to build lives that go beyond their mental health symptoms and any other challenges that they might be facing. Next slide, please. All right, so research shows that well-being and happiness aren't just pleasant experiences, but they're also drivers of better health outcomes. So here are some of the key findings from the literature on happiness and recovery. We see improvement in mental health symptoms. So when people focus on positive experiences and positive emotions, they often see improvements in symptoms like anxiety and depression. And these improvements can support their overall recovery process. Happiness is also associated with enhanced physical health and longevity. So people who are happier tend to have better immune function, so they're not getting sick as often. They tend to have lower blood pressure, and a longer lifespan. So these really suggest that emotional well-being benefits the entire body, not just the mind. And finally, we see vocational and economic growth. So research suggests that people who are happier tend to be more productive. They tend to have better outcomes at work, and as a result, experience more financial stability as well. So altogether, these findings suggest, suggests that happiness isn't just a byproduct of recovery. It contributes directly to those physical, emotional, and vocational outcomes. So by fostering happiness, we promote resilience and long-term well-being. Thanks, Jen. All right, so next we'll take a look at how positive psychology interventions have been used in people to help people with serious mental illness. Now, as Dr. Zechner mentioned, the research is still early, but I'm going to review some of it for you now. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So positive psychology is a relatively new field. It only was developed in the early 2000s. And since that time, there has been a lot of interest, both clinically with people using it in their practice and empirically with researchers trying out different studies. But only a few researchers and clinicians have explored using positive psychology interventions with people with serious mental illness. And when I say positive psychology interventions, I'm referring to structured strategies that are intended to improve well-being in people with serious mental health conditions. So while there hasn't been as much study of positive psychology applications among people with serious mental illness, there was a recent study in 2020 which reviewed all of the existing research with this population, and it did have some interesting findings. This type of review, which was called a meta-analysis, looked at studies which measured outcomes before and after positive psychology interventions. And the researchers were looking for overall findings in the data across all of the studies. So the research has shown that positive psychology interventions are linked with significant improvements in two main areas. The first is that we've seen increased subjective well-being. So those are things like happiness, life satisfaction, and positive emotions. And we also see improved psychiatric symptoms, so reductions in depression, anxiety, and other mental health symptoms. So the results from this review are early evidence that positive psychology interventions are a valuable addition to those traditional treatment methods. Next slide, please. All right. So in addition to looking at the effectiveness of the interventions, the researchers in that analysis I just mentioned also reviewed the format of positive psychology interventions. And there were a few different approaches among the studies with regard to delivery of the intervention. We've seen positive psychology interventions being delivered both in group settings or in one-on-one sessions. They've also been offered both in person or over the phone. Now, if you remember, this was a review from 2020, so this was before telehealth became such a phenomenon as it is now. So that's likely even more virtual options, but they weren't included in this particular review. The sessions for the positive psychology intervention were between 1 to 2 hours, and they did occur every week. And then the programs overall ranged from 3 to 20 weeks with an average of just under 9 weeks in duration. So this just goes to show you that positive psychology interventions can be flexible to meet those needs of your setting and the population that you work with. They can be adapted to be very practical for where you work. And although all of the interventions in this study were different, what they had in common is that they were structured opportunities to build strengths, enhance well-being, and just explore the benefits of positive psychology. If we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So a final consideration of the researchers who conducted this review was a summary of the various topics and techniques that were used in the different positive psychology interventions. So there was some variety across all of the studies, but these are just some examples to give you an idea of how you might incorporate positive psychology strategies into your work. So many of the interventions used practical techniques to increase positive emotions and experiences. So this might include intentionally reflecting on the good moments in life, however small that they might be, so that we can learn to focus on what's going well in our lives, and then seek out experiences that will create more of those positive moments. It's very reinforcing. Another topic was building self-compassion, which is practicing treating yourself with the same kindness and patience that you would a friend. This is, again, another skill that needs practice. It's not something that comes naturally to everybody, but it is a skill that we can develop over time. Some interventions focused on teaching people to identify their strengths. Sometimes it is absolutely easier to identify positive qualities in other people, but learning to recognize your own capabilities can be very empowering as well. Other interventions worked on cultivating kindness, so taking actions to do meaningful or considerate things for others, And this practice has actually been shown to increase the happiness level of the person who's performing the action as well, not just the person who's receiving the kindness. So everybody benefits. Now, a key technique used in positive psychology interventions is psychoeducation. And this involves helping people understand the connection between how they think, feel, and act, and also empowering them to take those small steps that will increase their happiness. Mindfulness techniques, like the breathing exercise we did at the beginning of this presentation, can help people focus and feel more grounded. Mindfulness exercises are not limited to meditation. I know those certainly not for everybody, but it really can include any exercise in which a person is paying attention to the present moment. It's acknowledging and letting go of any thoughts or distractions that's come about without judging yourself for having those thoughts or being distracted. Again, it's another skill that just takes practice. Goal setting was another technique that was used across these positive psychology interventions. And this can help people connect personally with an outcome that they'd like to see in their future. It can help them plan for their success, as well as any barriers that they might encounter as they're pursuing their goals, and keep track of their progress. And writing and homework were also used frequently in these positive psychology interventions, strategies like journaling. And this can be a helpful way for some people to learn. But it's really, really important to consider the needs and the preferences of the individuals that you work with. Dr. Zechner is going to share some details on feedback we received about our own positive psychology intervention about writing and homework. We had strong feedback from both the group facilitators and the participants. So it's important to just keep all of these things in mind when you're making decisions about how you want to incorporate positive psychology into your work.
Thank you, Kaitlin. Really, really good review of the literature there. So we're going to turn our attention now, like how can we practically use some of these techniques? It sounds like many of you are using them. We've got some great expertise, and I recognize we've got the chaplains, so we've got people who are experts in positive psychology. So I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, so to speak. But this is sort of a summary. And as you think of other things, I do hope you'll drop them in chat. We want to make sure that we're sharing everyone's expertise. Next slide, please. So I think that Kaitlin was talking about this concept. A lot of the ideas, self-compassion, gratitude, these kinds of things really can be integrated into existing groups and interventions, and they probably are. I know in the work that I've done in New Jersey, I've met positive psychologists who worked in the New Jersey State Psychiatric Hospital System over the years. I've met people who do many of these practices in the setting already. Also thinking about personal strengths, and I think that that's probably a common practice. Someone mentioned the VIA Character Strength Index, and I love that. I think that's a really helpful way for people to think about their strengths. It's a little exhausting to answer I forgot how many questions it is. It's a lot. It's like, about 100 questions about values, but about personal strengths, but helping people think about what are their strengths, things like perseverance, honesty, creativity, spirituality, and that should be identified and discussed, and people can tell you what their strengths are, and you can be helpful to remind them what their strengths are. Even when a person is not in a great situation, you can remind them of their strengths, and that can be very, very helpful to help someone remember who they are when they're well. It can also be helpful to reinforce the ability of a person to take action for happiness. And we're going to talk about this intervention that we piloted, but it was really about action. It's these little things we can do each day that contribute to happiness. Happiness isn't necessarily something that we receive. It's more the small things we can do each day, whether that's take a walk, practice some mindfulness, spend time with our pets or our children, or calling a friend, or playing an instrument, whatever those things are that brings someone to a more positive state of being or contributes to their well-being. So encouraging people in the hospitals to do the things that they can do in the moments that they can. Asking those questions about meaning and purpose, which could be more spiritual in nature, but it could also be literally what's most important to you. Those values clarification exercises are very, very helpful. And being sure to emphasize choice and personal control. And I know it's super hard in the hospitals to emphasize choice and personal control, but I think it's very important for us to be thinking about how we might offer those choices to folks, how to remind them that they have choices. They may not have as many choices in the hospital as out of the hospital, but how do we help people feel like there are options for them? And using those concepts that we were just talking about, like gratitude, building social connections, resilience, self-compassion, or practice reframing situations more positively. There's a great exercise from the Greater Good Science Center, which the link is in the resources, called the silver lining exercise, where you think about a situation that occurred and then you try to imagine what was the silver lining in that situation, which can be really, really challenging, but very powerful if you can go through it. Next slide, please.
Michelle, we had a couple comments in the chat that I just wanted to relay.
Mhm.
Tom says that the Toronto definition of mindfulness is awareness of the current moment without judgment. And Karen commented that there was a book back in the day, Throw Your Fastball 90% of the Time. And the concept was to spend your time using your strengths rather than focusing on fixing your flaws. Outcomes were improved self-esteem, increased sense of happiness, and feeling more connected. So I just want to touch on those before we lost those comments.
I appreciate that, Dawn, and thank you, Tom and Karen, for those very helpful comments. Definitely want to be sort of aware of what mindfulness is, and also, I love this idea of focusing on your strengths rather than fixing flaws. I mean, that's really captures a lot of what positive psychology is, and helps people remember that they're more than their illness. I know that I've worked with people with serious mental health conditions since a long, long time, 25 years, I would say. And I'm a family member of someone with a serious mental health condition. And I find it's so powerful to remind people of what they're capable of, and that things can shift and change. And even when people are very symptomatic and experiencing a lot of difficulties, they have strengths. There are things that they have going on for them. And I see someone just put in gratitude. That's really, really important as well. When you're doing these practices in the hospitals, it's really important to consider the reading, thinking, and writing abilities of who you're supporting. I know there's a huge difference, right? So in New Jersey, we have folks who are called CEPP. They're sort of on the wait list to get housing, basically. And for many of those folks, they're not very symptomatic, and they may be able to focus and concentrate and write things down. Compare that to someone who's in, just come to the admissions unit, who is, really in the middle of an acute psychotic episode, may have more difficulty with that. And what Kaitlin and I have found is that these positive psychology initiatives, and it's been in the literature too, can be very complex and hard to translate. And so you have to sort of think about your audience and think about how you would apply that. Also, having that sensitivity to lifelong experience of mental illness. When you ask people to share gratitude, for example, someone may feel really, sad about the experiences that they've had. They may have had experiences with trauma, poverty, job loss. So sort of helping people find that middle ground despite the life experience they may have had. Always making sure to match strategies to the person, what their preferences are and their abilities in that moment. And it may change. Someone who is very unwell, I've worked with people who are very symptomatic, and asking someone to think of 3 good things might be really hard, but if you give them examples, from your own life, sort of, well, my 3 good things today, I was able to have lunch, with my friend. I am able to get out of the bed on my own, and I got to talk to my mom. Keeping them very, very small, and then helping people kind of build up a little bit. Helping people connect to their core values within the goals, like why are these things important to you? Getting at meaning and purpose, because I did a talk once at a community mental health center where we talked about what is your purpose, and that was fascinating. Where we sort of talked about ask people, and it's very heady, it's very intellectual, and some people really love it, and some people really don't, and it's sort of finding the right match for people. and reminding people of their strengths. I think I already said that. I'm going to ask that we move on, and Kaitlin's going to give us some examples. And Kaitlin, maybe just one or two.
Sure. So yes, as Michelle said, these are strategies that you can integrate into your setting already. You don't have to start a positive psychology program, but in your interactions with people, whether they're one-on-one or in a group, these are some things that you might be able to try. So like Michelle said, gratitude can sometimes be really difficult for people living with serious mental health conditions. So it's teaching them how to reflect on the good and express thanks for the things in their life that are good. So an example activity here is just to think about something in your life that you're grateful for, whether it's big or small. So giving those examples, like a favorite sweater, maybe it's a song that you love or a great cup of coffee you just enjoyed. And then prompting to think about all of the people who were involved in bringing that to you. So it might be a friend or family member who gave you that item as a gift, the artist who wrote the song, or even just the person who served you the coffee, roasted the beans, played some role in getting that to you. So trying to think of at least 5 people who helped bring that item to you, whether or not you know them personally. And then taking a moment to express thanks for each person and appreciate how their actions brought you something good. So again, it's a habit, it's a skill that we can all learn and get better at. So this is one way that you might be able to teach a gratitude practice. If we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. You know what, Jen, can we do one more? You will have all of these slides available to you in the resources, so I won't go over the self-compassion. It was just a meditation, practicing saying kind things to yourself. But another skill or another strategy that you might use in positive psychology, relationships are really important. Your relationship with yourself and your relationship with others. So there is two goals within positive psychology: to strengthen the existing relationships that you have, but also to build new relationships, because a lot of times people who have serious mental health conditions have lost contact with some of the people that were important in their lives. So it's helping them to connect with others in a positive way. So this is an activity that can help people think about the different levels of relationships that they have in their lives. You can see the circles each represent a different level of the person's relationship, starting at the innermost circle, which is that relationship that you have with yourself that does require the most work. Then you have your closest relationships, your friends and family members, social contacts, which are people that you might encounter at work or at school, and then acquaintances, who are people that you do have some contact with, but you don't know very well. And so asking people to think about where other people in their lives, where people fit into the different categories in their lives, and how they maintain positive relationships in each of these circles, and if they have an area that they'd like to work on, or work on building relationships in a particular circle. Thanks, Jen. If we could go to the next slide. These are the strengths, as we've talked about. I won't go over all of them now, but they're, helping people identify their strengths. Just facilitating discussion around that can be really helpful. Next slide, please.
And so we're running sort of out of time. We want to make sure there's time for questions. We want to mention this positive psychology intervention called Positively Happier that we piloted in an outpatient provider, and we learned so much about it. It was written by Tony Zippel, and some of the exercises that we mentioned actually are from the manual. Next slide, please. This is a new intervention. Eventually it will be made available. We're still sort of in the draft stage and development. There are 15 sessions. There's a script for facilitators, and each session includes a focusing activity, a topic overview, a participant handout, a let's try it out, meaning it's an activity in the group, and practice on your own, something the person does outside of the group, and then session wrap up. Next slide, please. And there are 15 modules, as I mentioned. These are the list of the modules, and it follows the SPIRE, or spiritual, physical, intellectual, relational, and emotional model of whole being, which some people are using, including Tal Ben-Shahar, who is the psychologist from Harvard. And it really talks about happiness as a choice, and then we go through each of the dimensions. Next slide, please. And at the end, we encourage people to use something called WOOP, which is Wish, Outcome, Obstacle, and Plan, which is a way to help people build a happier habit or use these actions throughout the intervention. We encourage people and remind people that happiness is a practice. It's a thing that people can try to do. It isn't like you're going to go from completely unhappy to completely happy with one action. It's like a muscle. You have to build it up. You have to do a little bit each day to change a habit. Next slide, please. What did we learn? We just wrote an article and submitted it, fingers crossed, about our experience with Positively Happier. What we found is that people with mental health conditions loved the topic. The facilitators loved it. The participants loved the topics. We also learned that it's very complex. As I mentioned earlier, positive psychology is not easy. It really needs to be translated, I think, for people with mental health conditions, and particularly if that person may have some cognitive challenges or maybe having acute symptoms, or may have intellectual disabilities, or may not have their reading glasses. I mean, any of these things could happen, right? So we learned simplify, simplify, simplify. So Kaitlin and myself and another professor, Dr. Ann Murphy, we've worked for about a year to revise the manual. The third thing we learned was never say homework, never, no. And I saw that someone is doing IMR, and I've run IMR groups in the state psychiatric hospitals in New Jersey, and homework was never a happy word. So we had to alter, and that was also from the participants said, we don't like homework, we don't want homework. So we adjusted it to practice assignments, and really sort of making the point that these are opportunities to practice and then think about, like, did you like this activity? Was it helpful? Because each intervention, each module has one sort of intervention to try out. And as we mentioned, everything isn't for everyone. Some people like to meet new people or practice writing or try a new thing, and other people that's not for them. So next slide, please. So we covered a lot today, but basically we looked at positive psychology, which is the study of what's going well with a person and how to build that up. And it's been done a little bit in people with serious mental health conditions, and not so much is in the literature about it being used in psychiatric hospitals. I think Kaitlin and I both looked, and there's just really not a lot. So you all who are doing it, write some papers, get them out there. Also, we talked about supporting well-being and happiness really encourages mental health recovery, which is why we're all here, right? We're really committed to supporting people and having better lives. And happiness and really should be part of our conversation, I think, at every level of service in mental health. And positive psychology interventions can be incorporated into existing programs, as you're currently doing, or they can be developed as standalone interventions, like we gave you the positive psychology, the Positively Happier example. So I think we have time for some discussion and questions.
So we have a couple more comments in the chat. One from Robin, gratitude is a wonderful practice, thanking people for attending groups and having staff thank patients for each ADL that they complete at community meetings. We also thank the patients for having good days without behavioral issues. April stated that we touched on this in IMR today, discussing positive and reciprocal relationships or support systems. And Tim mentions that they use the term in between session activities versus homework. Justin has a question. What are some best practices for positive psychology focused assessment? Many assessments are deficit or obstacle based. How can we show evidence of strength growth?
Kaitlin, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that most of the assessments are created to capture where people are struggling and not where they do well. That inventory that Dr. Zechner mentioned with regard to the VIA strengths is a great way to get people talking about and thinking about the skills that they have and what they do well. There's also other surveys out there, particularly in the field of OT, where it's sort of a profile or an inventory about the meaningful activities that people have in their lives. So there are some tools. There are certainly not as many that are deficit as are deficit based, but there are some tools out there when it comes to thinking about strengths.
Yeah, and we've just been looking at this. We're doing some research and we're looking at some happiness inventories, and they're not great, unfortunately. So we've kind of liked the what's the one we're looking at, the one of the PERMA inventories right now. I think as our favorite. There's the subjective well-being survey, and there's the subjective happiness scale. So there's some out there, but in terms of strengths, it's pretty limited. Great question.
We have a couple more comments. Karen says that we offer challenges, team and solo, with a celebration at the end of the month for people engaging in those challenges.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And I want to, I just want to get back to also someone was talking about gratitude and thank yous. It's also, I think, really helpful to just as well as expressing thank yous for sort of the behavioral piece, which I know in hospitals is really, an important piece. It's also, kind of an opportunity to look for the person's strengths and comment on them to, as gratitude, but also just an observation like, thank you for doing the thing I asked you to do. But it could also be like, I want to just, I just want to point out that I'm really impressed with your perseverance, that this is a hard time for you. And today you were really able to show up for the things that you needed to do. And I want to thank you for that. So that's a, kind of a slightly different spin on it to call out the personal strengths as well as the behavior, because I think that can build up the person's self-esteem and think about themselves. I don't know, Kaitlin, if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Gratitude also just for being who they are. And we talk about compassion and self-compassion and teaching people to learn to accept themselves, the good and the bad. So definitely recognizing, especially in those moments of struggle, are important.
And Tim posted a resource. He said that much of this resonates with the Science of Wellbeing class that he took at the local library online when the pandemic first hit. And the link is there in case anybody wants to check that out. Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And I think through Coursera, I don't know if that is the same one, because you can take a Coursera course for either free or limited cost on positive psychology as well, which is very rigorous. I've tried to take it in the past and I wasn't quite prepared for the level of rigor. I'm busy, I got things to do. But if you want to learn more, definitely check out the Coursera stuff. And the Positive Psychology Center at UPenn has some resources, and we included that in as a resource to consider as well. I will say it's confusing when you Google positive psychology. The first thing that pops up is this Positive Psychology Center, and I don't know who those folks are, but they're not related to UPenn. So I would always look for, my favorite is Greater Good Science Center as a resource, because those are folks from UC Berkeley and they have done amazing work. They have a magazine. We've included the resources in the slides. They've got tons of exercises that you can use in any group. And they're really wonderful. They're wonderful things we could do for ourselves as well, because they've done research on like nursing staff during the pandemic and practicing using the 3 Good Things template. So definitely check out those resources as opportunities. I really like the Greater Good Center, Science Center, because everything is free pretty much, and there's a lot of different opportunities.
We have one final comment. Well, maybe not a final comment, but our last comment so far. We have a success plan. Karen says we have a success plan that patients can use to track and note their progress.
That's wonderful to frame it in that way. Kaitlin, you look like you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say that's very reinforcing to be able to, it's empowering to be able to track your own progress and then to look back and see how far you have come. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, to remind people of their strengths, to remind people of what they're good at and sort of what they're building on and moving towards. It's it's a very interesting when we piloted the Positively Happier intervention, it really made people think. I think that the topics that got people most nervous was the physical well-being, and there's a ton of research on physical connections and including things like nutrition and exercise, like making sure that we eat healthy and that we, move our bodies, but also sleep, and then touch was another topic. There's a lot of evidence that hugs and handshakes and petting animals and being like physically touching people is important. And how do we translate that concept in a population that may not always, may be struggling with symptoms and may not always sort of understand in the moment all of those things. So, but I think that it's exciting to see the work that everyone is doing. And I really, really just want to say, I want to acknowledge your strengths in offering positive psychology interventions and your commitment to people living with mental health conditions and their well-being. Thank you. This is very important work, and it's very exciting to see the level of enthusiasm and the work that you're all doing.
So we have about 4 minutes, I'm sorry, left in the webinar. If anybody has any additional questions or comments for Dr. Zechner or Kaitlin, please feel free to post them in the chat.
And don't forget, Dawn posted a link to the training evaluation so you can access all of the slides from today's presentation that has some resources on it. There's some links to the Greater Good Science and the Penn Positive Psychology Center that Dr. Zechner was talking about. There's a whole list of references and other resources, so you'll be able to access these slides and a certificate of attendance. And this is the link in case you didn't get it. If you can't do that today, I will send out a follow-up email in the morning with the link and also a link to the archive so that you could watch the recording when it's available. That should be by tomorrow afternoon. And there's a quick question, any referrals for worksheets or groups?
Again, I mean, Kaitlin might have other thoughts, but I really like Greater Good Science Center because they have generic examples. Another resource, which I don't know if it's free or if it's paid, but Therapist Aid often has worksheets, and they may have some on positive psychology. I don't know for sure that they would have exactly what you're looking for.
Yeah, and in addition to those, it's included in the references list, but all our strengths, they have really done a good job of adapting the language, which can be kind of lofty about, personal human strengths, and making them really accessible for people. So they've got worksheets there as well.
All right, well, I'm going to take the last minute or so of today's presentation to remind everyone that there's the IPPER Award finalists that are on our website. Dawn posted the link to our website. You can find it right at the top that says IPPER Award, vote here or vote now, I forget. But there's the 3 finalists, and thank you so much for anyone who has submitted a proposal, a nomination to nominate either yourselves or someone else. We had so many great programs from around the country that sent in nominations, and we were like really excited to see what great stuff is happening around the country. So it was really hard getting it down to the top 3, but we picked the top 3, and now it's up to you, the voters, to pick the finalists. Voting is open until December 31st. So if you haven't cast your vote yet, please go on and do that. You can read the submissions from all 3 of the finalists, and then the winner will be announced at next month's prep webinar on January 21st. So make sure you come back on the 21st to see who the winner was.
And I just wanted to mention that I did post that link in the chat. So if you all would like to take the opportunity to vote and learn more about those programs that are competing for first place, you can click on that link there.
Thank you very much. And with that, we wish everyone a really super happy holiday season. And thank you all for another great year of prep webinars. And we'll have some really exciting stuff coming up next year. So stay tuned and we'll see you all in 2025. Take care, everybody. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.